Hello and welcome to the lecture presentation for week 10 of this course. And this is Philosophy 111, and week 10 we're going to be talking about the subject of class and technology, and continuing some of the themes that we've been really focusing on in this course and in the last couple of weeks in particular. Concerns of surveillance and the concerns of privacy that arise from contemporary forms of electronic surveillance. That's going to be another significant issue this week, as we'll see. So we have two articles this week, as usual. We have Through Google Colored Glasses by Noble and Roberts, which, as we'll see, is looking at Google Glass and its social and cultural consequences. And The Limits of Technology by Clayton and MacDonald, which is based on a case study that was done in the town of Sunderland in the northeast of England, a relatively deprived area of the country, and a study on digital and social exclusion was done by the authors, and they talk about this in the article, and it allows us to really think about some of the ways in which technology is kind of limited in its ability to help people sort of reach forms of social inclusion, important things like employment and health and so on. So we'll take a look at that secondly as well. All right, so let's focus firstly on Noble and Roberts and Through Google Colored Glasses, and this focuses on the wearing of Google Glass, and here we can see I think this is one of the Google founders, Sergey Brin, who's sort of wearing the eyewear that's sort of distinctive. It has an outward-facing camera, so it can sort of record things. So it's a form of wearable tech, and it gives the user access to forms of data. It can integrate sort of searches and recognition technology. And sort of things that can build a data profile, and so it's caused a lot of discomfort among people who feel like they're under surveillance when they're sort of when they're sort of targeted by somebody wearing this piece of technology. So this has been quite a controversial thing, especially in San Francisco, as we'll see, where Google is based. And the authors use this phrase throughout the article, this idea of the colonial gaze. And the phrase actually comes from a scholar called Edward Said, who was at Columbia University. And he was a very well-known scholar in Orientalism. And the idea of the colonial gaze it's a term to capture the sort of the way that Europeans sort of project a certain perspective about the native peoples they encountered, and sort of enframed them within a certain idea that Europeans are sort of able to manage and control this space, and natives are to be sort of managed by Europeans. Their bodies are to be used in ways that are useful to Europeans. The sort of spatial arrangements and social arrangements are to be sort of reorganized in ways that serve European purposes. So all of that comes under what Said calls the colonial gaze, the sort of projection of a sort of power and control of white Europeans on native populations. And there seem to be echoes of that, according to the authors, in the sort of way that Google Glass works as a sort of privileged project of wealthy elites, and sort of so it recapitulates elements of that gaze in the new sort of in the new urban setting of the contemporary United States, and in San Francisco in particular. Anyway, let's take a look at some of the claims made by the authors here. So They say early in the article on page 1 that whiteness and class elitism are core values in the Google Glass design imaginary. And Google Glass privileges an imaginary of whiteness and unbridled exploration and intrusion into the physical and emotional space of others. So these phrases are kind of conjuring up this idea of a kind of, again, the kind of colonial explorer, somebody who sees themselves privileged and entitled enough to sort of to enter the space of other people and to reconfigure, to intrude into that space and reconfigure that space for their own purposes, to sort of derive data from it that they can then use to sort of drive projects of their own. And of course, this, as we'll see, is related to this idea of Google Glass as a kind of colonial project of exploration and intrusion is linked to certain practices of Google itself as an entity that sort of pushes people, pushes poor communities out through using certain laws to allow gentrification. So there's a lot of sort of interlinked issues here, and Google Glass just seems to the authors to really sort of encapsulate and summarize this sort of privileged idea of whiteness in terms of exploration and intrusion into other people's space and making that space, reconfiguring that space for their own purposes. So these features seem to run through the project itself in terms of its sort of the way it's marketed to an elite who are then going to have privileged access to a certain sort of perspective, a certain sort of ability to surveil and control the space of others. So there are a number of privacy and surveillance concerns, again, mostly related to the outward-facing camera in Google Glass, which again, I guess not, everybody's familiar now with cameras on cell phones and stuff, but it seems a little, I guess, an extra step to have the technology more sort of disguised and camouflaged in the form of eyewear. But things like theft of ATM passcodes, the recording of copyright material, cheating in casinos and gambling, and of course recording individuals without their consent. All of those issues have sort of come up in relation to individuals wearing Google Glass. So the sort of glass and class rage, and specifically in California, has been driven by a couple of issues. One of the very, very controversial things among poorer communities has been the Ellis Act and the way that Google has been quite the way that and its employees have been quite aggressive in using the Ellis Act to drive convictions of buildings which are then converted into high-end apartments, which then Google employees and other kind of elite employees can move into, and so the neighborhood is sort of gentrified and poor people are sort of moved outside the city. So it's the aggressive way that the Ellis Act has been used to reconfigure poor neighborhoods, which has been and to gentrify those neighborhoods, which has been very controversial in California, in San Francisco, in California, where Google is based. And so there's been a lot of backlash and a lot of sort of community resistance to this use, which is now sort of growing up and starting to fight back. Another point of contention has been the Google buses, which are private buses, very very high-end buses with Wi-Fi and very sort of comfortable seating. And Google buses sort of they drive around the city, and they often use public infrastructure like public parking, public bus parking spots to pick up their Google employee passengers. So there's been a lot of anger about the company, using these sort of private very kind of elitist bus lines, and at the same time using public spaces and public infrastructure as sort of as part of that. So the people have thrown sort of rocks at the buses and broken windows and stuff, and there's been a lot of community resistance. But I think probably the main thing is it's been seen as another symbol of gentrification, and it's another sort of sign of the way that Google is intruding into poorer neighborhoods, changing them and sort of converting them again into sort of higher neighborhoods for their own employees who live far away, who may live there but who work far away on Google's campus. So the gentrification is driving a lot of the anger to this, and that itself is described as a colonial project by the authors that seeks expansion into new territories and neighborhoods, despite there already being inhabitants of those spaces. So again, it's sort of it downplays the the meaning of those neighborhoods to the people that live there, and sees them as kind of new territories that can be sort of reconfigured and reshaped to the purposes of these wealthy workers who sort of want to live in an urban setting. So there's a sort of colonial a kind of colonial element to the way that this works, with elite workers who tend to be white and Asian men moving into these poorer neighborhoods of color and sort of kicking out the people that live there through Ellis Act evictions. So this has been the sort of really driving the public acrimony and the public resistance to what Google has been doing. Now, the authors talk about the Panopticon and the idea of panopticism, which is a sort of the word itself means optical, the seeing eye, and pan is the word for all, or sort of totality. So the Panopticon is a kind of all-seeing eye, something that can sort of see the totality of the space that's arranged in front of it. So a central point that Michel Foucault makes when he talks about the Panopticon in Discipline and Punish, his book in 1977, he says, "The Panopticon must not be understood as a dream building. It is the diagram of a mechanism of power reduced to its ideal form." Right? So the Panopticon is a form of power that's based on the idea of surveillance. That's a sort of form of surveillance as power. And it's really the way that that's the experience, and ideally in a kind of prison or a mental hospital or a school, a barracks, these kind of large public institutions that can sort of have this idea of a sort of central idea of power that is sort of surveilling everything around it. So everybody who's sort of subject to this power has the experience of being constantly surveilled, and that experience sort of affects behavior, affects self-awareness, and leads to them kind of monitoring their own behavior. So it's a form of power that works on sort of changing individual sort of expectations and the way the sense of constantly being watched sort of changes your decision making. So power in the form of surveillance and control is built into the physical structure of the Panopticon itself, where the whole, whether it's a central point and the whole sort of space is arrayed around it. So from the sort of central position of power, you can see everything else, but from those positions you don't have the same sort of the same encompassing view. So it's a physical structure that embodies that power in the form of surveillance. But we can certainly say today that when we think of panopticism, maybe it's been extended today by increasing public surveillance, right? So not just institutions where this takes place, like prisons and barracks and mental hospitals and stuff. But also the increasing the increasing presence of surveillance cameras in public spaces, leading to just, the constant sense of being watched in public space. And of course, also digital self-surveillance, using new apps and devices, sort of things like biodata that can be gleaned from new apps and devices like Fitbit and other sort of apps that people use, whether it's for exercise or for health. So new forms of sort of biosurveillance have now become possible, and of course individuals are using this for themselves, for exercise routines and stuff. But of course we can think of more insidious uses of the technology, that it could be sort of used to monitor, sort of health companies monitoring whether individuals are, really sort of looking at going with the program and exercising and sort of, monitoring their own health and sort of using that to make healthcare decisions. So that there are more insidious uses that we can certainly imagine, but I think we can certainly see the new potential with the new digital possibilities of surveillance. New biodata and public surveillance have rapidly expanded the sphere in which we're sort of in which we sense that we're being watched. So Jeremy Bentham was the inventor of the idea of the Panopticon, and it was taken up by Foucault in the 20th century. But according to both of them, they both adhere to this idea that this sense of being constantly watched without being able to verify the watching leads to a constant feeling of being under surveillance and control that leads to a kind of self-monitoring and self-censorship. So you're constantly watched, but you can't verify when it's actually taking place. So it feels like a constant surveillance, which leads you to sort of modify, to monitor and modify and censor your own behavior. So power is kind of power is being sort of exerted on you to sort of to adapt, to change or whatever, through this sort of constant sense of surveillance. Now Google, another thing that sort of leads to some of the skepticism and the distrust, I think, of what Google is doing, is its embedded relationship with the state. And in particular, it has an embedded relationship with the NSA, the National Security Administration, and many of its products like Gmail and Google Maps and its internet search capabilities are able to monitor activity through its data mining of users. So there's immense potential for Google to sort of gather information through its products and then to sort of data mine and pass that information onto national security organizations. So Google is the embedded relationship with the state that Google has sort of taken on, and it provides many tools to the NSA in terms of its surveillance capabilities. So it's a problematic position. It's a private company, yet it has a sort of an official role in national security. So it's a kind of in-between position that leads, given the sort of distrust about the national security in administration and what it does and how it operates. That distrust also filters down to Google in the way that it promotes the data mining and the sort of spying that's done by the NSA. Schiller, writing in 1996, describes a shift of power and control from the state to private actors, and this is part of Google's unique situation here, as sort of in between, part of the state and part of the private sphere. So a shift of power and control from the state to private actors, leading to a massive consolidation of power in the private sector. This has been intensified, of course, by media conglomeration and monopolization of specific areas of digital technology by transnational corporations. So we can see this problem with entities like Facebook Amazon, and Google, of course, entities that are extremely large and seem to have monopolized key areas of digital technology, so that they don't really have any competitors in their in their specific sphere. And so through doing that, they're able to sort of accumulate this enormous capacity to gather data about people, and then to sort of use that data in ways that are potentially harmful, in sort of, whether that's by allowing people on the platform that are doing harmful things, or whether it's by collaborating with the state to collect information about individuals without their consent. There's certainly enormous potential for abuse in the way that these companies have allowed to become large monopolies, and they've allowed to amass immense power and control in terms of their ability to collect data and to collect information on individuals. So one of the issues here is the way surveillance changes our experience of space. So this is from Koskela in 2000, who says, what is characteristic of surveillance design is its paradoxicality. Forms are at the same time transparent and opaque. While everything and everyone under surveillance is becoming more visible, the forces and potential helpers behind the surveillance are becoming less so. And again, we can see this with the the charge of elitism with Google Glass, the colonial mentality that with surveillance there's a kind of, it creates this division between what's sort of in view, which is transparent and opaque, but sort of behind the scenes, the people doing the surveilling and how it's done, that's incredibly opaque and is not visible. So it creates this split in the layout of space between a very sort of open and accessible space that can be surveilled by people with sort of access to technology or sort of elite or an elite perspective, and everybody sort of behind who's doing the surveillance who is not visible. And of course this creates immense distrust about what's, and this is part of the Google Glass backlash, that there's immense distrust about what people are doing with the surveillance, about whether people are being recorded without their knowledge, and so on. And so it's the sort of invisibility that's sort of problematic here. All right, let's take a look at Clayton and McDonald's essay, which is based on a case study on the impact of technology in areas of broad social exclusion. The case study focusing on Sunderland in the northeast of England, and a number of questions they asked about the process of social inclusion and exclusion. So let's get a sort of sense of what we're talking about when we talk about the idea of social exclusion. So social exclusion focuses on many overlapping processes that exclude individuals and communities from the mainstream, from sort of access to resources that are available in the mainstream. And those include financial well-being, employment, health, education, family dynamics, and social networks and social capital. So individuals suffering social exclusion are usually deprived in terms of one or more of these key areas, and they're usually interlinked in a way that sort of makes sense, that they're all kind of interlinked. Lack of employment leads to lack of health. Education is related to employment prospects, and so on. So it tends to be a sort of package that a sort of package of disadvantage that individuals who are socially excluded will have these, or the lack of these elements in different combinations. So in the last few decades, a lot of talk um, has been about the digital divide. And of course, as more and more services and activities are accessible online, a lack of access to those channels leads to people becoming more and more excluded. So of course there's an international digital divide, which is very stark. In terms of the number in different parts of the world. North America and Asia are the most, and Europe are the most sort of online parts of the world, of course. So there's a kind of north-south digital divide in the world as a whole, but of course there's a in each domestic country there's a that divide takes different forms as well. So we can see that also in wealthy countries, some people have access to broadband technology, some people don't. Some people have laptop computers and internet connections, reliable connections. Other people don't. So in terms of access to technology and whether that's sort of promoted in schools and so on, there's still a great deal of there's still a considerable divide. So we can see we can see those sort of divisions, and as increasingly services and activities are accessible online, the lack of access to technology becomes more and more problematic and becomes more and more of a disadvantage. So, the relation of digital and social exclusion. And the authors find and they argue that the access to and the ownership of ICTs, information and communication technologies, is not enough to overcome the many forms of social exclusion. Right? So just having information and communications technologies, just having access to good internet and a laptop and everything else, isn't by itself sufficient to overcome the forms of social exclusion. The capacity to use technology effectively requires various forms of economic, social, and cultural capital. And that sort of idea of different forms of capital really comes from and was theorized most systematically by the French thinker Pierre Bourdieu. And so we'll take a brief look at that. So if we think of different forms of capital, obviously the most common sense one is economic, as we use sort of the word capital for wealth and so on. So financial and other tangible assets count as economic capital. The money to sort of pay for college, the money to pay for resources that are going to be helpful in terms of education. So financial and other tangible economic assets. That's very straightforward. And so the bottom right, social capital. So here it's things which sort of, you can see here how living in a certain type of neighborhood is going to give you certain forms of social capital, family networks and relationships. So people living in neighborhoods that have a lot of social capital tend to have a lot of sort of weak connections with people, but those connections are powerful because those people are often have positions which can be sort of leveraged in networks. So if you live in a neighborhood where a lot of people do professional work, you can leverage those connections to find people to talk to find entry interviews for different kind of jobs and positions, or simply to find information about how you go about thinking about a particular profession or a particular job. So those sort of networks, those social networks, are really important for allowing people to sort of convert their economic capital into social capital. In other words, to leverage their sort of economic assets by building on their sort of their family and their networks and their sort of social relationships, which are often really essential for sort of finding out possibilities and finding out opportunities that otherwise you wouldn't know about without these networks. And so the top right, cultural capital, builds on both the economic and the social. And again, it's knowledge, things like knowledges, tastes, things you like, things you don't like, cultural dispositions. So often a kind of informal, often things that you don't necessarily think about, but obviously things that people are judged socially on. What kind of, not how you inhabit your own knowledge, whether you're confident in expressing your perspective, what kind of tastes you have, whether you have sort of the sort of cultural dispositions that fit with a certain profession, a certain way of doing things. So cultural is more intangible, but we can certainly see how you sort of build that by living in a certain place. You acquire a certain relationship to knowledge. You might acquire self-confidence from sort of being around people who are sort of self-expressive and confident themselves. So all of these things are interlinked, as we can see. And symbolic capital, your qualifications, sort of honors and reputation. So things you can't necessarily see, but things that accrue to you in virtue of things that you've done or things that you've acquired, and sort of things that you can sort of leverage again to claim authority, or to claim knowledge and capacity in certain areas. So all these are interlinked, and they're all it's not just economic. There's all these other forms of capital that count in terms of how we're able to leverage our position in seeking different forms of social advantage. So while technology is often treated as something special apart from our everyday lives, its use cannot be examined in isolation from a range of offline social structures and practices. So this is really telling us why why we can really understand that just access to technology itself doesn't do a lot to overcome social exclusion in its really, its sort of deepest points. And that's because when we're online, we're still sort of drawing on offline networks, offline practices, offline ways of interacting. It's not like we suddenly become different people. So the value of it is going to depend a lot on what our offline structures and our offline networks are like, whether we can sort of leverage those online. So it doesn't give us something apart from our everyday lives, but simply puts our everyday relations in a different kind of electronic form. All right, let's talk about the three key domains of social inclusion that the authors talk about, and why why online engagement by itself is not sufficient for giving individuals the capacity for inclusion. So by itself, just online networking and being online doesn't change, doesn't take away the problem of social exclusion. So we can see this first in relation to social networking and civic participation. Online networking often involves the maintenance of already existing social relationships. So online engagement is not necessarily an engine for development of community participation or enhanced social mobility. So it kind of just replicates our offline relationships, but in a slightly different form. But of course, that by itself doesn't lead to an enhancement of our capacity for social networking and civic participation if we're not linked up with those possibilities, and we're not sort of culturally aligned with those possibilities in the first place. And again, going back to the sort of theory of capital, you need to have the social and the cultural capital as well to be able to access those domains. So merely being online doesn't by itself give individuals that capacity to access. Second area is educational achievement. And in the study that Clayton and Roberts do, and that this article is focused on, they talk about the perception of the impact of technology on educational achievement, and the way that perception varies with occupational status. So possibly related to the lower social and cultural capital of people in so-called manual and routine occupations, that they're not able to leverage their position through being online to use technology to sort of drive improvements in educational achievement. So the highest earning groups and the children of highest earning groups report the greatest link between education and use of technology, that the use of technology sort of really helps drive their education, which in ways that wouldn't have been possible offline. But that's much lower in the case of people who are more likely to be poor and working class, and more likely to work in manual and routine occupations. The third area is employment and income. And again, here it's perceptions of influence of technology on employment prospects varies widely with occupational status. And we see the same arrangement where people with people from the highest sort of with the highest occupational status, the sort of professions. So there we find there's a larger influence of technology on employment prospects. They're able to leverage technology to improve their employment prospects. It's much lower in the case of manual and routine occupations. There's much less of a link. So access to the internet does not alter issues in relation to qualifications, the ability to meet criteria, and also nowadays the heightened competition for most positions. Right, so just being able to access the internet and submit an application online, for example, doesn't change the sort of the qualifications, the criteria, whether you have the qualifications for the job, and it obviously doesn't deal with, but in fact intensifies the issue of heightened competition. So there's a considerable variation in terms of individuals' class and social positions of how they experience technology helping their employment prospects. Okay, let's think more broadly about what we can take away, some of the things we can take away from this week. So we discussed a critique of Google Glass from Noble and Roberts, that Google Glass, a form of wearable tech that has come under criticism as a class-based and elitist project of submitting others to the colonial gaze. So it'd be helpful this week if we can think of other ways in which working class and poor communities are subject to forms of surveillance and control. Are there other ways, other technologies where these communities are subjected to increased surveillance? So I think we'll think about that on the discussion board this week, and there are some articles to look at to get us thinking about this. And secondly, we saw that deriving benefits from engagement with technology varies a great deal with occupational status or social class. Occupational status is a sort of marker of social class. So have you experienced the digital divide in your own life in some capacity, in some sense? You might want to write about that on the blog post this week, your own experience with technology, and whether this study sort of resonates with your own experiences. It would be might be interesting for us to talk about that this week as well.